Hello, everybody. Welcome to The Table. I'm your host, Josh Bass. Thank you so much for pulling up a chair with me to the table. It's actually ironic that that's my intro because I just got a new desk and I'm standing currently. And so thank you for standing with me at the table. If you are also standing in some sort of environment, we're just going to get right into it because I got a lot to talk about and this is just super important. And we're just going to go. So pull up a chair. Let's talk. Let me ask you something. When people experience you, what do they walk away with? Not what they think you believe, not what you post, and not what you'd say if somebody asked. I mean, what do they actually experience? Because whether we like it or not, we all represent something. And just to remind you, we are currently in a series called Chameleon, and the whole point has been pretty simple. A chameleon blends in, but Jesus calls his people to stand out, not to be annoying, not to act superior, but to live like they actually belong to a different kingdom. In part one, we talked about how patterns, how we can conform to patterns without noticing, but how Jesus invites real healing. In part two, we talked about identity and being chosen, being claimed, being known before you ever earn anything. And so if you haven't listened to those, I would recommend going back, listening to those, get caught up, and then come back for part three. And so today we're going to get to what naturally comes next. If you're chosen, then what? I've been changed now, then what? And so this episode is about representation. And before we jump into the Bible, let's make sure we understand the word ambassador. An ambassador is someone who lives in a place that's not their home, and they represent where they actually belong. They don't show up speaking their own message, and they certainly don't freelance their own opinions. They represent somebody else. So when the Bible calls followers of Jesus ambassadors, it's basically saying, you live here, but you belong somewhere else. And your life is, and it should be, and it's supposed to point to that. Now, I can already kind of hear how that can sound. Some of you are like, cool, but I'm not religious. Some of you could be like, I believe, but I'm not the speaking up type. And if that's you, that's totally fine. Just stick with me. Today's passage comes from 2 Corinthians 5:18 through 21. And a little bit of context. This is a letter written by a man named Paul. And this man was an apostle, and this letter was being written to a church in the city of Corinth. And that church had issues. They had division, they had ego, they had a lot of conflict. It was not a perfect community by any means. And honestly, that's what makes this a lot more relatable. But here's what Paul says, and this is coming from verse 18. And we're going to kind of break down each individual verse. All this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. Now, let's pause right there. The statement, all this is from God. That's a big statement. Paul is saying this doesn't start with you reaching for God. It starts with God reaching for you. And then he says, God reconciled us to himself through Christ. And if you're not familiar with the word reconcile, it just means to restore something that was broken. Like when a relationship is fractured or trust is broken, distance sets in, and then something happens that brings restoration. And the Bible claims that that's the main story. Humanity separated from God, and God is moving towards humanity to restore it. Paul keeps going, verse 19, that God was reconciling the world to himself in Christ, not counting people's sins against them, and he has committed to us the message of reconciliation. That line, not counting people's sins against them, is heavy. Paul is saying God's approach isn't scorekeeping, it's mercy. And then it gets even more personal because in verse 20, Paul says, we are therefore Christ's ambassadors, as though God were making his appeal through us. Just sit in that for a second. God is making his appeal through his people. Not through perfect people by any means, not through people who never mess up, but through real people. And Paul says, on Christ's behalf, we are to be reconciled to God. That isn't a threat. That's an invitation. Then Paul closes this section with the core of the gospel itself. This is verse 21. God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. Now, that verse can feel confusing if you've never heard it before, so let me say it plainly. The Bible teaches that Jesus lived without sin, without rebellion against God, and yet he took our sin on himself so that we could be forgiven and made right with God. And now that's not a try harder, that's rescue. That's the foundation of reconciliation. And here's where this gets real. If God reconciles people to himself, then it changes how we handle people. Not perfectly, but noticeably. Jesus says something that would have shocked people in his day. And it comes from Matthew 5:23 and 24. And this is part of what's called the Sermon on the Mount. He says, this is Jesus talking, if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there you remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there. First, be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift. Now, that's wild. Jesus is basically saying, don't use worship as a cover for unresolved relational damage. It's not that worship isn't important, but he's saying that reconciliation matters that much. So here's a table question. If the people around you only see brokenness, bitterness, division, what incentive would they have to believe that you've encountered a God who heals? Now, I don't say that to guilt you. I just say that to think honestly. And Jesus shows us what standing out looks like. And this is why I love the way Jesus lived, because he didn't just talk about reconciliation, he embodied it. Think about John 4, Jesus and the woman at the well. And I think I've already used this verse or this story before in this series, but it speaks to this whole idea so well. Now, a little bit of context before we get into it. Jews and Samaritans did not associate. There was a deep ethical and historical and cultural hostility, and most people avoided each other completely. But Jesus walks into that space and starts conversation anyway. He crosses cultural boundaries, social boundaries, and there's this woman that he treats with dignity, and he speaks truth to her without crushing her. Jesus was willing to stand out rather than fit in for the sake of one person. And that's what an ambassador does. Not chasing approval, not afraid of awkwardness, not ruled by the social rules of the moment. But here's the part where most people get stuck. They'll say, okay, so I'm supposed to speak up, right? Maybe, and sometimes. But the bigger question is, are you willing to represent Christ both in life and in speech when the moment is right? Because Paul also makes something clear. You don't control outcomes. In 1 Corinthians 3:6, Paul writes, I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. And this verse has saved so many people from spiritual anxiety because it means this: you plant the seeds and you can maybe even water the seeds, but you're not the one who actually makes it grow. And so rejection isn't always about you. Sometimes it's just that the soil isn't ready. Your job isn't to pressure people into belief. Your job is to be faithful, present, honest, loving, and consistent. So let me zoom out real quick, because why does any of this matter? Because the Bible doesn't teach that God stayed distant and just sent instructions. It teaches that God came near. Jesus is God's clearest picture. God in the flesh showing us what love looks like, what truth looks like, what holiness looks like. And then Jesus did something even more unthinkable. He took rejection so you could be welcomed. He took the consequences of sin so you could be forgiven. He made reconciliation possible. So when the Bible calls believers ambassadors, it's not saying, hey, go be impressive. It's saying you're carrying a message that changed you, a grace you didn't earn, a mercy you didn't serve, and you get to invite other people into it. Now, let me slow down a little bit, not to overthink, just to notice. What do people experience when they experience you? Do they feel judged or do they feel safe? Do they feel rushed or valued? Do they feel like they have to perform or like they can just be honest? And here's a harder one. If someone knew nothing about God, what picture of God would they build just by watching your life? Now, listen, if you're not sure you believe any of this, you're not behind. You can still sit at this table because even if you don't call it faith, you still know what it means to represent something. So what story is your life telling? And for those of you who do follow Jesus, maybe this week isn't about being louder. Maybe it's about reconciliation. Who do you need to forgive? Who do you need to speak with instead of speaking about? And where do you need to stop blending in and start being present? Because ambassadors don't just talk. They live like their citizenship is real. Now, next episode is going to be the last one of this series, and we're going to talk about love and imitating Christ, because if we miss love, we miss the whole point. Until then, remember who you represent. Remember the kingdom behind you, and remember your home isn't here. Thank you for pulling up a chair. I'll see you at the table next week.